Mars taught a course on the JFK assassination at the University of Texas at Arlington. In 1989, his book, Crossfire, The Plot That Killed Kennedy, was published to critical acclaim and was a New York Times bestseller. His book became a basis for Oliver Stone's film JFK, for which Mr. Mars served as the chief consultant. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome The View from Mars, Jim Mars.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Howdy. Hey, come on, y'all from Texas. Howdy. Howdy. Now you're talking. And I want to really thank all you folks that put that sign up outside of town. You know, I'm coming in and I see it and it says, "Welcome to Texas." And I thought, boy, that's great. Now, wait a minute. I was born in Texas. I still live in Texas. What are they talking about here? Yeah, I live up in rural Wise County, about 50 miles northwest of Fort Worth. That's where I raise my registered quarter chickens. You know what a quarter chicken is, right? Just 25 cents. It's just cheap chickens. I get rid of them, but we need the eggs. All right, so here we are tonight, and we're talking about UFOs. But wait a minute. I know Nick Pope asked the question, would our government lie to us? And my answer is only continually. In fact, if you go back, we could spend a whole seminar for a couple of weeks talking about Waco, Oklahoma City, the Boston bombing, Sandy Hook, on and on, but we ain't got time for that. So let's go back and start with the granddaddy of them all, the Kennedy assassination. Now, they always say that I'm into conspiracy theories. No, I'm not. I'm into fact. Okay? And so we could talk for hours and hours here about the Kennedy assassination, Camelot, the bullets, trajectories, ballistics test, autopsy, foibles, missing in evidence, and, so let's go back and play Sherlock Holmes, and we're going to start right now with the crime itself. Got a little machine here that supposedly works, so I'm going to just quickly run through some things that all you need to know about the Kennedy assassination. What you need to know is that in connection with the assassination of the 35th President of the United States, there was fabrication of evidence, suppression of evidence, alteration of evidence, destruction of evidence, and intimidation of witnesses. Now, folks, these are crimes. If you or I did this in connection with, say, a murder case, we could be thrown into prison. Because under our legal system, if we did all this, we are accessories after the fact. Okay? And here in Texas, we've executed people who are accessories to murder. The facts of the case show they didn't pull the trigger, but they knew about it. They handled the gun. They handled the money. They drove the getaway car. And under our legal system, they are considered as guilty as the person that pulled the trigger. So let's take a look at some of this evidence. We got fabrication of evidence. Okay. One of the best pieces of evidence they used at the time, and I notice we have a pretty good split audience here. We got some old farts like me who were probably alive and were there that weekend. And then we got a lot of younger people who either, were just infants or hadn't even been born in 1963. It's hard for me to realize how much time has gone by because for 30 years I taught a course on the Kennedy assassination at the University of Texas at Arlington. And so every semester I looked at those newsreels all over again, looked at the films, photographs, heard the witnesses. And so to me, the Kennedy assassination is still very fresh in my mind. But to a lot of people, it's not. But you may recall one of the strongest pieces of evidence against the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was when they said we have his fingerprints on the rifle. Well, that seemed dissension. But let's take a look. Let's take a closer look. That rifle was taken away from the hands of the Dallas police the night of the assassination and shipped to Washington. The very next day, in this document signed by J. Edgar Hoover himself, it says, no latent prints of value were found on Oswald's rifle, cartridge cases, unfired cartridges, the clip of the rifle, or even the inner parts of the rifle. So on Saturday, there's no fingerprints. On Sunday, the rifle is shipped back to Dallas, and on Monday morning, the two FBI guys, Vincent Drain and Harrison, carry the rifle over to Miller Funeral Home, where they were preparing Oswald's body for burial. This is the old Fort Worth Press, and they noticed an FBI team with a camera and a crime lab kit spent a long time in the morgue. Well, wait a minute. Oswald had been alive for 3 days almost in police custody. What do they need to go to the morgue for? Paul Grudy, a wonderful guy, who was the mortician at the time, and when I was a young police reporter over in Fort Worth back in the 60s and 70s, he told me over and over how he was there when the FBI came in and put Oswald's dead hand on the rifle. And that night, Henry Wade, the district attorney of Dallas, casually mentions to the news media, have I mentioned we've got his fingerprints on the rifle? Is there a chain of evidence? No. Is that legitimate evidence? No. Also, we find that they said they have these 3 empty shell cases, and that there was 1 live round found in the Mannlicher Carcano that Oswald supposedly used in the assassination. Now, here's what's interesting. See the arrows? Particularly these. You see there's a little crimp in the shoulder of the cartridge case on these 3, the one that was in the rifle, and these 2 that they found on the 6th floor of the schoolbook depository. The FBI crime lab said that is a peculiarity of the Oswald rifle. When you cram the shell into the chamber, it puts that little crimp on them. Notice the 3rd cartridge does not have that crimp. But it does have a little crimp up on the neck, which, if that was there when the thing was all together, it wouldn't have been able to be fired. So we got a problem with that pieces of evidence. I might point out that originally the Dallas police sheet, and I may show this, showed that they had only had 2 cartridge cases. It was only about several days later when a Dallas police official said, oh, that's right, I got a 3rd cartridge case, and I forgot about it, and I carried it around in my pocket. How's that for a piece of evidence? Okay? And, of course, this was after the government decided there were 3 shots, so they had to have 3 cartridges. Here's what appears to be the same FBI document. Both of them signed by Vincent Drain, both of them with the same file number. One of them was released in 1968, and it says that the paper found on the 6th floor of the school depository that they said was used by Oswald to wrap the rifle in and smuggle it into the book depository matches the paper that was used for wrapping paper in the book depository. And since Oswald worked there, this is pretty incriminating evidence that he got some of this paper at work and he used it to wrap the rifle in. But in 1980, this document slips out. It looks like the exact same document, but it says that the paper found on the 6th floor does not match the wrapping paper at the school book depository. So wait a minute. And when the FBI was asked, well, what's the deal with this copy over here and that came out in 1980, we were told by an FBI official that, that's a phony document. How many other phony documents are in FBI files? And then now you've got this newspaper clipping from Roy. I had to get out of the Seattle Times because it never went anywhere else. This is Gerald Custer. He's not a conspiracy author. He's not a researcher. He is the naval technician that took the x-rays of President Kennedy's body at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And he says today these are fake x-rays that were being shown. On the same podium with him was Floyd Reeby. Floyd Reeby is not a conspiracy theorist. Floyd Reeby is the photographer who took the autopsy photographs of President Kennedy. And what does he say? He says that the photographs released by the National Archives are phony and not the photographs we took. Wait a minute. So, where's the real evidence? And as you can see here, the X-rays that the National Archives showed today show a huge defect in the right front portion of President Kennedy's skull. And yet the autopsy photographs, that area is perfectly okay. Somebody's lying. Something's going on here. And, of course, we've got the cockamamie single bullet theory. He says, well, there was only 3 shots fired, and we know one of them missed because it nicked a guy named James Tague standing down near the triple underpass, and then you got to have one shot that hit Kennedy in the head, so that only leaves one shot if there's only one shooter. And yet, how are we going to explain these 7 wounds to Kennedy and Connally? Oh, well, they explain it this way. One bullet coming from 60 feet in the air strikes Kennedy at the 3rd thoracic vertebra, doesn't strike any bone, but somehow courses upward through his body, exits out his Adam's apple in his throat, then somehow changes direction, goes back down, strikes Connally near the right armpit, shatters his 5th rib, comes out near his right nipple, goes through the anterior top side of his wrist, shattering the wrist bone, and ends up in his left leg. Oh, yeah. Anybody ever fired a gun? How many times does a bullet bounce around inside that beer can? It makes a hole straight through. And here's the proof of that. Here's Commission Exhibit 399. Oops, come back. The so-called magic bullet. This is the bullet the government says actually caused the wounds to Kennedy and Connally, including striking Connally's 5th rib and shattering his wrist bone, as we can see in the X-ray of Governor Connally's wrist. You can see it broke that big wrist bone. We also see these bright metal pieces, okay? There's more pieces of bullet metal that was still in Connally's arm when he finally passed away and was buried than is missing off the bullet that you're being told caused the wound. And where was this bullet found? It rolled off a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. And they tried desperately to get the man who found it, Darrell Tomlinson, to say that it came off of Connally's stretcher, but he wouldn't do it. And who was in Parkland Hospital about 1 o'clock? Jack Ruby. We have a photograph of him, and we have several people who knew him well who said they saw him. And in fact, a TV news reporter that I interviewed told me that he knew Ruby. He'd been in his club, and he saw Ruby carrying TV equipment and slipping into the hospital. So who planted that bullet? Probably Jack Ruby. Alteration of evidence. This is a little bit detailed, and I hate to bore you with it, but it's extremely important. This is the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, better known as the Warren Commission. And this is Ward and Paul, public stenographers, who were deposing James C. Cadigan, a fingerprint expert with the FBI. Now, in his typed up thing, we see that somebody has scratched out a whole section. And when he's asked, do you know why Exhibit 820 was not reprocessed or desilvered, he says, well, I can only, I'm hard to see that, I only guess, I guess. And somebody's written in, no, this is a latent fingerprint issue, and then they've scratched out the rest of his statement. That is a crime right there to tamper with an official transcript. So what is he trying to cover up? What he's covering up is that, and sure enough, the Warren Commission followed through. And in their report, they said Cadigan's, that when they asked him why wasn't Exhibit 820 not reprocessed or desilvered, he said, no, this is a latent fingerprint matter. So what was he covering up? Well, because what we find out later is that what was axed out said that there was a big batch of evidence brought into the laboratory on November the 23rd. That's the day after the Kennedy assassination. That's the Saturday that they took all of the evidence away from the Dallas police, the night of the assassination. And he said there's a very large quantity of evidence. There were several agent examiners to evaluate the material. There were supervisory officials. There were representatives of our internal security division. So the top SBI officials now are poring over all of the evidence with no chain of command, no public oversight, nobody to see what they might have been putting in there or taking out. Okay? And sure enough, when you read the testimony of Chief Curry, the Dallas police chief, he says, well, on Friday evening, we kept getting calls from Washington and asking us to send all the evidence up there. And Captain Fritz, who was in charge of the homicide investigation, said, well, I'm trying to conduct an investigation here. We got to have people identify the rifle. We got to take statements. How can I do that if you're going to take all the evidence away? But Curry finally says, well, there was somebody in high office requesting this, and we finally agreed as a matter of trying to cooperate with them. So they sent all of the evidence back to Washington. He says, talking to J. Lee Rankin, the senior counsel of the Warren Commission, he says, well, did you ever get that evidence back? And he said, well, we were supposed to get some copies. He said, but no, I never received any of that evidence back. He said, perhaps the commission has it. And J. Lee Rankin, the chief counsel of the Warren Commission, said, yes, the commission is still working with it. Now, what does this mean? This means that for 3 days because it was Tuesday, November the 25th, that the news media announced they had a big meeting between the Dallas police chief, the sheriff, and the district attorney, the FBI, and they called in the FBI because at the time, this was not a federal crime. The feds had no jurisdiction. This was a Texas homicide. But on Tuesday, following the Friday assassination, they announced the FBI was taking over the case. But in truth, they had had all the evidence since the very day of the assassination. With no chain of evidence, no oversight, no way of knowing what they did with it, what they took out, what they put in. Now, do you understand why there is so much controversy over the evidence in the Kennedy assassination? And there you have it in the Dallas Morning News on November the 22nd. Excuse me, I think I said the 25th. It was the 27th where they said the FBI takes over all the evidence in the Kennedy assassination. Yeah, right. Okay, now here's a picture I took myself before they closed off that 6th floor window. This is before they turned it into the 6th floor museum, which they say they're not trying to present any particular viewpoint, and yet they plexiglassed off that whole corner of the 6th floor so nobody can get to that window and look out of it. And that's because what you find is that it's only a foot away off the floor. That's the floor. And the window's only a foot off of there, and then the window was open about halfway like this, so you just got this little bitty narrow object, a line of sight. There's two 2-inch pipes to the immediate left of the window, which is going to create a problem for anybody trying to aim off down Elm Street. But the key thing is that where this overhead sign is, and it was not there in 1963, but it is today, that's where the first shots were fired, and you can see the problem. There's a tree intervening in the line of sight. But they don't want you to see that. But if you ever get to Dallas and get to Dealey Plaza, watch the traffic, please. But right out in the middle of Elm Street, and then look back up at the 6th floor window, and you won't be able to see it because that tree was trimmed back for a TV special in the 70s. It was trimmed back again for the Oliver Stone movie, and today it's in essentially the same configuration that it was in 1963. And you can't get a line of sight from that window to the point in the street where the shots were fired today, and you couldn't in 1963. This is what I was mentioning earlier. The Warren Commission shows us this Commission Exhibit 233, and it shows that they found 2 6.5 spent rounds. And yet in 1991, when I went over to Dallas and they had opened up their police files and I found the original Dallas Police evidence sheet, I noticed that they only had 2, and it's been changed to 3 by the Warren Commission. So they only had 2 cartridges at the time, but as I mentioned, one of them suddenly turned up days later. Would never have been admitted in a court of law. You also notice that the bottom of the Warren Commission document is blank, but the original Dallas Police evidence sheet says paraffin test made on Oswald was positive on both hands and negative on the face. This is evidence he did not fire a rifle that day, because after his arrest, they took him to police headquarters, they put hot paraffin on his hand and on his cheek, okay? And I've got a copy of the paraffin test report in my files, and it said they found traces of not gunpowder, but they found some evidence on his hands, but no gunpowder or nitrates on his face. Only traces of nitrates on his hand. And you can get nitrates from any number of things, including book printing ink. And, of course, we know that he worked at the book depository and was carrying book boxes around all morning. So that could explain the nitrates. But there's no gunpowder on his hands. And the key thing is no gunpowder on his face. Why is that critical? Because any of you who own bolt-action rifles, you know what I'm going to say. To be able to fire 3 rounds in 6 seconds, and since it takes 2 seconds just to cock the bolt and pull the trigger, the 3 is the maximum number of shots you could fire in 6 seconds, and that doesn't even count regaining your sight picture or taking aim. That's just bang, bang, and you cannot lower it to do this. You're going to have to keep it right up here. And when you open that bolt, boom, you're going to be hit with nitrates and gunpowder. But he had none. Evidence that he had not fired a gun. And yet the Warren Commission, they, instead of explaining what that is or perhaps why it didn't matter, they just delete it and hide it from you. You have all the doctors at Parkland, all of them, and they all said that Kennedy had a gaping wound in the right rear portion of his head. Well, that indicates an exit wound. And yet when the government showed us these drawings, where's the gaping hole? It's not there. What it did show was this, what they said at the time was the entrance wound, the bullet hole in the back of his head. And yet when the autopsy photographs finally were released, we see that there wasn't a bullet hole there. It's just a little piece of dried hair or something. You can see a hair growing through it. It's not a bullet hole. And in fact, Commander Humes, who was in charge of the autopsy, when he was shown that photograph, he said, well, that don't look like anything I saw. The official autopsy sheet states that he was hit at the 3rd thoracic vertebra, which is my stubby fingers, right here between your shoulder blades, a little bit to the right of the backbone. And on the autopsy face sheet, that's exactly where it shows the wound. And this is the one the Warren Commission published, and they said, oh, well, it's just a general drawing. It's not really accurate. But yet, what did they leave out? On the original face sheet, we see verified by Dr. George Berkeley, Kennedy's personal physician. So rather than know that that's where the back wound was, they took this out so they could say, oh, well, actually it was up on the neck. And yet his coat shows a bullet hole exactly where the autopsy showed, 3rd thoracic vertebra between the shoulder blades to the right of the backbone. Now they argue, well, his coat rode up. He was waving and his coat kind of bunched up and the hole in the coat is actually much lower than where it actually struck. I think that's cockamamie, but let's assume that's true. Here's his shirt. Your shirt doesn't rise up that much and the hole is exactly the same place. And again, here's how they mess us around. There's the hole in his jacket, and yet over here, when they show the drawing of the autopsy, and here's a bullet hole in his back, and now it's not between the shoulder blades at 3rd thoracic vertebra, and it's not really in the neck, it's kind of up in the shoulder straps. Okay, and what I love is, if this was Kennedy's body, and if there was a true bullet hole right here where they said it was, they've got it covered up with a ruler. Now, this is interesting. If you'll read my new version of Crossfire, I published these pictures and some other things too. And this is the Zapruder Frames 257, which shows what the back of Kennedy's head looked like in normal light. The reflection of the sun off the top of his head, his ear. And now we see 357, which there is a very obvious black blob that has been painted onto the back of his head to cover up that gaping wound that was so obviously an exit wound. If you'll read my new Crossfire, you'll find that not only have several people who worked on this film the very weekend of the assassination before it was turned over to Time Life and kept hidden from the public for 15 years before it was made public. But that there are 11 Hollywood experts in video and special effects, and some of them who have worked in the industry dating back to the 40s, who said this was obviously a artificial artifact. In fact, they said it was kind of crude and it had been painted on. So you can't even trust the Zapruder film. That is not necessarily an accurate picture of what happened because it's been tampered with. And who had control of the Zapruder film? Only the U.S. federal government.
I put this picture in there too because I wanted to show you frame 314. Here it is, the driver of the car rear, and you see his hairline, you see a white spot. That's the sun looking off
his greased hair. And here's Roy Kellerman, and here's the same intensity of light reflecting off of his hair. And you can see that Kellerman's hands are on the steering wheel. And so
the next time you hear somebody say, oh, well, the driver turned and shot him.
Didn't happen, okay? But that does not necessarily exonerate the Secret Service. The driver, Greer, was the oldest member of the Secret Service detail, and he had served 3 other presidents besides Kennedy. So his loyalty was to his service, not necessarily the president he was serving. And contrary to his testimony to the Warren Commission, which was he didn't even know the assassination happened. He was just driving along, and then Kellerman next to him said, we've been hit, get us out of here, and that he never looked back, and he then stepped on the accelerator and accelerated the car out of the plaza, which is according to Secret Service regulation. First sign of trouble, you hit the gas and you get out of there, okay? And but as you can see here, it's not true. From this film and the Nix film, as the car comes down the incline on Elm Street and the first shots ring out, the brake lights come on and the car slows to almost a complete stop. And Greer turns and looks back over his right shoulder, right directly at Kennedy, until after the fatal headshot. And then and only then does he face forward and the lights go off and the car accelerates. And this is what Dealey Plaza looks like from the air. Now, today, of course, some of you may have been lulled by some of these TV specials, and even books like Gerald Posner's, I believe, where they say, "Well, we've done a computer analysis." Okay, well, this is very important. Here is my computer simulation. Okay. It's a shot came from the 6th floor depository, went right through the middle of the tree, hit the sign, bounced back, hit Kennedy in the throat. Okay? Hey, don't laugh. A computer did that. Okay? We all know computers, garbage in, garbage out. You can program a computer to do anything you want. Okay? And if you'll look, I went and interviewed some years ago both Chester Brenneman, who was an associate of Robert West, and I interviewed Robert West, who was the county surveyor of Dallas County. Both those men were hired by Time Life on Monday following the Friday assassination to do survey work in Dealey Plaza to determine distances, elevations, all kinds of things, trajectories. And they said, number one, they worked with the Secret Service, and at the time, everyone concerned said there's no way one person did all this. And Chester Brenneman told me that while they were working on this and working out of some rooms in the Adolphus Hotel, he noticed one of the guys from Life magazine was wearing a bulletproof vest. And he said, you know, what's that for? And the guy said, my life's not worth a plug nickel on this deal. Okay? And then in the spring of '64, both Brenneman and Bob West were hired again to do the survey work for the official government Warren Commission. And they, both of them told me and confirmed to me that the Warren Commission altered their numbers. And here you can see the original plat map that Chester Brenneman allowed me to copy. And they even mentioned that this area, which is where one of the first shots hit, is hid behind tree for any shot from the depository as of May '64. They also show here's an area, bullet shot on the curb. There's another shot. Where did that one come from? And then they noticed the yellow mark on the curb. Yellow mark on the curb. If you go to DV Plaza today and go over to the south side of Elm Street and go down approximately where the headshot took place, you're going to still find traces of yellow paint on the curbing there. And this is quite interesting because it's only apparently was about a stripe of about 2 feet, and then there's about 10 feet space, and then there's another 2-foot stripe of yellow paint. And if you'll slow down the Zapruder film and watch it very carefully, you'll see the bright yellow streak by. So on the day of the assassination, these 2 little stripes on the south side of Elm Street were bright yellow painted. But what's that all about? I've checked with the Dallas City streets people, and they said, no, we never did anything like that. And if you stop and think about it, if they wanted to paint the curb yellow to like caution, they'd paint the whole curb, right? Not just a little strip here, a little strip there. And what happened right in between those 2 yellow strips? The fatal headshot. This was marking the kill zone for multiple gunmen using triangulation of fire to catch Kennedy in a kill zone. Here is where you can see the numbers were altered by the Warren Commission. Now what this means is that any computer simulation that you see from now on that is based on the government figures is wrong. And you know, if you're off by a 1/16 of an inch up here, by the time you get out to 100 feet, you know, you're off 20, 30 yards. So you cannot put any confidence in any computer simulation if they're using government figures, which I just showed you have been altered. Now, we do know that Life magazine came out in February of '64 with this picture of Oswald and the title, Lee Oswald with the weapons he used to kill President Kennedy and Officer Tippit. This is February of '64. The Warren Commission had just gotten underway. They didn't come out with their report until September of '64. How's that for guilty until proven innocent? And if you look at the backyard photograph, you'll find some real problems. Oswald, as you can see from his Dallas police mugshot, had a little sharp cleft chin. And yet the picture in the backyard shows him with a broad, flat chin. And there's a line, breaking the emulsion, that goes from one corner of his neck to the other corner of his neck. And this is right out of Will Fritz's report that's published right in the Warren Commission. He said, this picture has been enlarged from the crime lab, and Oswald said the picture was not his, that the face was his face, but that this picture had been made by someone superimposing his face, and the other part of the picture was not him at all, and that he had never seen the picture before. That's right in the Warren Commission report. But of course, nobody read that, and everybody thought Oswald was guilty, so never mind what he said. But wait a minute, is there any proof that what he said was true? Well, here we've got the 2 pictures of the backyard that were found supposedly in Oswald's belongings at the Payne home, and they're labeled 133A up here and then 133B over here. And if you make them into it, supposedly these are 2 separate pictures taken with a handheld camera. And if any of you remember the old handheld cameras that you look down into, you know, you take a picture and then you roll the film and you take it again. Okay, nothing in those photographs should match. And yet, when they're made into a blue and red transparency and laid one on top of each other, you're come back.
Come back. Nothing can come back. Stubby fingers are nothing. You see that his face is an exact
match. This is impossible with a handheld camera, unless Oswald was telling you the truth and it's his face pasted on somebody else's body, somebody with a broad chin. Suppression of evidence. A lot of you remember from the Zapruder film, you see Jackie Kennedy crawl back on the rear deck of the car and then crawl back into the car, and Clint Hill's trying to hang on as the car accelerates. And of course, that's been the subject of a lot of misinformation for years. They say Mrs. Kennedy was trying to escape the car. They say Clint Hill was, grabbed her and pushed her back in there. This is not true at all. The truth of this little episode was that Jackie Kennedy crawls on the rear deck of the car, braces braces herself with her left hand and reaches out with her right hand and takes a piece of the president's skull, cups it in her hand, and crawls back into the car under her own power, with Clint Hill just hanging on for dear life. And we know this is true because Dr. Pepper Jenkins at Parkland Hospital in the Warren Commission testimony, he said Jackie Kennedy looked shell-shocked as she circled. I noticed her hands were cupped in front of her as if she was cradling something, and as she passed by, she nudged me with an elbow and handed me what she'd been nursing in her hands, a large chunk of her husband's brain tissue. I quickly handed it to a nurse, and Clint Hill tells the same thing. Okay, now that's quite an emotional, human, and you know, a vivid account. Why all the confusion? And why haven't people been told about this? Because if Jack Kennedy crawled on the rear deck of the car and picked up a piece of his brain, that indicates a shot from the front. Because if he shot from the front, it would go to the rear. If he shot from the rear, as we're told, it would all go to the front. It didn't happen. Okay, even the sniper's windows got changed. The Warren Commission showed us this picture and said that's what the sniper's nest looked like, but the Dallas News that very day ran this picture over here, which is a different configuration, and then the Studebaker, the FBI guy who was taking the pictures for the Warren Commission, testified under oath that, as late as Monday he was taking some of those pictures, and he had moved those boxes all around. Worthless as evidence. In 2004, I was working with the Japanese TV crew, and they asked me some questions. I answered and asked them if they would send me a tape of their program, and they did. And I found it very interesting, even though it was in Japanese. I don't speak any Japanese. But they also, obviously, had a whole section on the Zapruder film and the fact that just as Kennedy's car is coming towards the Stemmons Freeway sign, there's a very obvious break in the film. And there's about 6 frames missing there. And I was well aware of this, as was a lot of the researchers. And we had always thought that Time Life had probably cut those frames out to compress the time frame of the Zapruder film so that they could try to support that cockamamie single bullet theory. But it turns out that the Japanese Asahi Television was able to find a version of the Zapruder film that had not been cut. In fact, they found a friend of Jim Garrison's in California that had a copy, and then they found another researcher in Dallas who also had a copy without the splice, and they subjected this to analysis by people in Poland and in the UK, and guess what they found out? There was a bullet strike on the Stemmons Freeway sign. That's what got edited out. Here's another shot. So now we got a shot in the street. We got a shot, to Kennedy, a shot to Connally, a shot to James Tague, a shot on the manhole cover. Now a shot to the sign. Now we got 6 or 7 shots being fired. Obviously, could not have been done by one man. Also, never explained is the Dallas News. My counterpart, Earl Goltz, was writing for the Dallas News while I was writing for the Star-Telegram, and he interviewed a lot of people, including Dallas police officers who, in the aftermath of the assassination, encountered men in suits flashing Secret Service identification and saying, "Don't come back here, it's all taken care of," or "Nothing happening back here." Who were these people? Because officially, all the Secret Service agents were either at the Dallas Trade Mart or riding in the motorcade. There's never been any effort to find out who were these people that had Secret Service identification that was apparently good enough to even fool a Dallas policeman. Interestingly enough, again, buried way back in appendix of the Warren Commission report, you find that none other than Lee Harvey Oswald had an encounter. He says that as he was standing in front of the school textbook building and about to leave it, a young crew cut man rushed up to him and said he was from the Secret Service, showed a book of identification, asked him where the phone was. Oswald said he pointed toward the payphone in the building, and that he saw the man actually go to the phone before he left. Now, isn't that pretty amazing? Okay, we're told that less than an hour later, Oswald stopped by a policeman out in South Oak Cliff, and he guns him down. Here, he's encountered a man who shows him a book of identification, says he's Secret Service, and he calmly shows him where the telephone is, and then stood around to make sure the guy got to the phone. And, of course, now they try to argue that, well, that was just a reporter. Well, excuse me, I was a reporter at that time. And, yes, I carried a press card. And, yes, sometimes I stuck it in my hat, just like you see in all the old movies, you know. Or I'd flash it. But nobody I knew ever had a book of identification. Who has a book of identification, a leather folder with a badge and an ID? The FBI, the Secret Service. Okay? So, again, we're being lied to right down the line. Again, we're back to the backyard photograph, and what you're probably unaware of is that the two photographs that they found that weekend, 133A and B, there's a third photograph that turned up 15 years later in the hands of a Dallas policeman's widow whose husband worked at the photo lab for the Dallas Police Department and left that photograph with her and told her to hang on to it, that it'd probably be worth something someday. So in this photograph we see, we see that Oswald, come back. Where my thing is. There we go. Man, I got to get smaller fingers. Okay, we can see the pose, got the rifle in his left hand, the communist paper in the right hand. And yet the Warren Commission, Exhibit 37, look what pose they use. They use the same pose as the backyard photograph that was missing for 15 years and suppressed from the public. And why was it suppressed? Because when it's brought up to the same proportion and it's laid over the face on all three photographs, the face of Oswald match exactly what he said. His face was pasted on somebody else's body. And just to show you how cockamamie the single bullet theory is, here's Arlen Specter demonstrating the single bullet theory. He says, well, it went through Kennedy's neck, and then it went down and struck Connally. But notice, come back, you notice they almost accurately marked the spot of the bullet in Kennedy's back, down by the shoulder blades, and Arlen Specter has to hold his straight edge up about 6 inches off the guy's shoulder to make it work. They knew at the time it didn't work. In fact, here is a page from the transcript of the Warren Commission meeting of January the 27th, 1964, page 193. And this, keep in mind, this is even before they started doing any serious investigation. They were just getting organized. And their chief counsel, J. Lee Rankin, says, well, it seems quite apparent now, since we have a picture of where the bullet entered the back, that the bullet entered below the shoulder blade to the right of the backbone, which is below the place where the picture shows the bullet came out the neckband of the shirt in front, and that bullet, according to autopsy, didn't strike any bone at all, that particular bullet, and go through, so that how it could turn, and about this time he realizes what he's saying. How could it turn in midair and go back down and hit Connally, so he shuts up? They knew as far back as January of 1964 that this single bullet theory didn't work, but they're still trying to sell it to you. Destruction of evidence. This is a picture the Star-Telegram ran the next day, and it's a little blob here because I took a picture out of the newspaper, and then it's been made into a slide, and it's in this PowerPoint. But believe me, I've seen the actual print, and you can actually see the little cylindrical slug that's lying in the grass there right next to a manhole cover, and it says, the bullet fired by the murderer of President Kennedy lies in the grass across Elm Street. Okay, well, wait a minute. What happened to that? Chief Curry published these pictures. Here we see a Dallas policeman kneeling down and looking at the place near the manhole cover where the bullet landed in the grass. Here we see a sandy-haired guy reach down, pick the bullet up with the Dallas policeman Foster and with a deputy sheriff standing there looking at him. And here we see him put it in his pocket and he walks away. That was the end of that. That didn't happen. If it wasn't for these photographs that were published by Chief Curry, we would never know that this even happened. So there's another bullet. Now we're talking 6-8 bullets. Destruction of evidence. Here's a picture they said that was taken of the back of General Walker's house by Lee Oswald as he cased the joint and before taking a shot at General Walker in the spring of 1963. I interviewed Walker back in 1964, and at the time there was a lot of speculation that he and some of the right-wingers in Dallas might have been behind the assassination. But after I interviewed him, I found out some very interesting things. First off, he told me that Jack Ruby and Oswald knew each other and that the Warren Commission was wrong, and that they'd have to start all over just on the fact that Ruby and Oswald knew each other prior to the assassination. He also told me that at the time that somebody took a shot at him, went through his window, hit in the wall, that the police told him that it was a .30-06. Well, Oswald was never known to own a .30-06. But here we have this picture, and you can see that in the Dallas police evidence sheet of the evidence they took out of Oswald's apartment, there's the picture, and you can see there's no big black hole where the license plate is. And yet when the Warren Commission published it as Exhibit 5, somebody's poked a hole in the license plate so you can't check to find out who that car belonged to and who might have been mixed up in it. Now, this happened while it was in official custody. That's official destruction of evidence. And Oswald, I might also mention, Oswald had a Minox camera, okay, commonly known as a spy camera. And what was really interesting is we checked and found out that it had a 5-digit serial number. And when we checked with Minox Corporation, we found that all the small miniature spy cameras sold at that time in the United States carried a 6-digit serial number. That means Oswald had a spy camera that was not commercially available, which means some intelligence service probably issued it to him. We also can show you this photograph of the limousine at Parkland Hospital. You notice they put the top back up on the car. They've got the lid open. They were cleaning it all up. Here's a bucket of water. They're washing it all down. This is nothing more than destruction of evidence. On orders of Lyndon Johnson, that car was torn apart, broke down, bulletproof glass put in it. It had been blue. It was painted black. It was armor plated, okay, and never studied forensically by anyone in the investigation. That's destruction of evidence. We know that Agent Hosty, who was assigned to Oswald prior to the assassination, and whose name and phone number and address and license plate number were found in Lee Harvey Oswald's notebook, said that Oswald had left a warning note at the FBI office a couple of weeks before the assassination. And yet, 2 days after the assassination, he was called into the office of the FBI agent in charge of Dallas and told to destroy the evidence. He started to tear it up, and he said, "No, I want it out of this office." So they tore it up, and they flushed it down a toilet. Now, wait a minute. That's, again, blatant destruction of evidence while in the hands of federal authorities. Now, what kind of warning was it? They said that Oswald was warning the FBI to leave his wife alone. Well, if it had been a warning from Lee Harvey Oswald threatening in any way the FBI for any reason, come on, folks, it would have been published on the front page of the Life magazine. But it was styled as a warning, and I think it was a warning that there was going to be an assassination, because I also have information from talking to Dallas policemen, and I'm sharing this with you all. It's not in my book because I couldn't prove it, but I talked to several Dallas policemen back in the 60s and 70s, and they said it was general knowledge that about 2 weeks before the assassination, the Dallas police had received a letter signed by Alex J. Heidel, which was Oswald's alias, and warning that the president was going to be shot when he came to Dallas, and encouraging them to change the motorcade plans. But, of course, the Dallas Police Intelligence people, they'd never heard of Oswald, and they probably get lots of crank letters, so they simply filed it away. After the assassination, that weekend, the FBI went into Dallas Police headquarters and ransacked the whole place. They even told me they went into the motorcycle officers' saddlebags. They went into their lockers. They went in, and anything they thought even might have something to do with the assassination, the FBI took it, and the letter disappeared. intimidation of witnesses. Here's a variety of witnesses who all said that the government tried to make them say things that weren't true or try to get them to change their testimony. Major Phil Willis is a favorite of mine. He was a great old guy. And by the way, his claim to fame was he was the first American soldier to take a Japanese prisoner in World War II. He had been stationed over in Hawaii at the time of Pearl Harbor, but he was in the Army, and they had him on a beach patrol. They had him with a rifle guarding one of the beaches there on Hawaii, and there was a little two-man Japanese sub that had gotten into some action and had been damaged and was sinking, and the two-man crew tried to swim to shore, and one of them didn't make it, but the other one, exhausted and spitting water, kind of crawled up onto the beach, and Willis went over and took him prisoner, becoming the first American to take a Japanese prisoner in World War II. Great guy. Went on to become a major. And he and his whole family were there in Dealey Plaza taking pictures at the time of the assassination. In fact, he took a picture that the Warren Commission did publish in which he showed me and he said, "I knew Jack Ruby, and that's Jack Ruby." And he pointed to Jack Ruby standing in front of the Texas School Book Depository. So the Warren Commission actually published that picture, but hey, by some quirk, they cropped it and cut it right through the figure of the person that was Jack Ruby. So you'd never know it unless you talked to Phil Willis. I asked Phil Willis, I said, well, how did they handle you? How did the Warren Commission handle you? And he said, oh, hell, I'd tell them yes, and they'd put down no. And that pretty well sums up the Warren Commission. You can read from these other people who claim their testimony was altered. Yeah, Jean Hill, if you look in the Warren Commission report, it says they took her testimony at the Federal Building in New York, Dallas, the Federal Building in Dallas, because she refused to go to Washington. She had friends in the Dallas Police Department and told her, if you go to Washington, you're probably not going to come back. So she refused to go, so they sent Arlen Specter down to interview her in Dallas. And he didn't take her to the Federal Building. He took her to Parkland Hospital. He put her in a little small windowless room and browbeat her and tried to get her to renege on her testimony. In fact, at one point, he told her, he said, look, we can make you look as crazy as Marguerite Oswald. And everybody knows how crazy she is. We could have you put in a mental institution if you don't cooperate with us. That's your government tax dollars at work. And here, these are just some of the witnesses who told things other than the official story who were ignored and left out of the Warren Commission report. There's even questions over Oswald's identity. And if you think that sounds crazy or conspiracy theory, here is a document from 1960, 3 years before the assassination, from J. Edgar Hoover to the Security Division of the State Department, and he says that there is the possibility an imposter is using Oswald's birth certificate, and any information Department of State has would be appreciated. Wow, think about that. J. Edgar Hoover personally was aware of Lee Harvey Oswald 3 years before the assassination and thought that someone was impersonating him. See, we have no idea what's really going on. And now we get this picture, Commission Exhibit 2963, supposedly taken of Oswald about the time he tried to defect to Russia. And it's really an interesting picture because if you look at it closely, you find that although the light source is coming from his right, see, with light here and heavy dark on his left side, behind him his shadows goes to the right. So what's that about? And then you notice there's a break in his hairline and some weird stuff on it. It looks like his eyebrow and his mouth's been painted in. And so if you draw a line down and separate them, you got two separate people. You got Lee, and you got Lee here, and you got Harvey here. And this is what they do with people who are spies, okay, agents. And they want somebody to impersonate somebody. Then they'll get a photograph of both of them, split composite, put them together, and it kind of looks right. And that way, when they go through a checkpoint or show your ID, then they kind of look like the photograph. And here we get other same things happening. Over here, we got, here's Lee, here's Harvey. Here's Lee. Here's Harvey. This one's great because, see, the mouth lines up, the eyes line up, but this one's about an inch shorter. And that's the whole deal. Oswald's Marine record shows that he was 5'11", and yet his autopsy showed he was 5'9". I always thought the Marine Corps built men. I didn't know they tore them down 2 inches. So we don't even know who Oswald really was. In fact, going back to Paul Greer, the funeral home director, he told me that about a week after they buried Oswald, the Secret Service showed up and was asking him about marks and scars on the body. And one of them finally quipped and said, we don't know who we have buried in that grave. Oswald's own mother in 1967 asked for an exhumation, saying that she wanted that there was some question about the identity of Oswald. In fact, if you'll read the Warren Commission volumes very carefully, you'll find that his mother, his brother, and his half-brother, all three told the Warren Commission that when he came back from Russia, he was really changed. That his thick hair was now thin, his big bull neck was now a little scrawny neck, and his cheeks were hollow. They all said he didn't quite look the same. But, of course, keep in mind, in 1963, nobody would have thought the government capable of substituting someone for someone else. So, these are all criminal acts, all occurred at the federal level, and they're all done by accessories after the fact. So who's guilty? J. Edgar Hoover and his next-door neighbor and buddy, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And who profited most from the assassination? Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover. Who completely controlled the investigation? Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover. Johnson appointed the Warren Commission, funded it out of presidential funds, and in doing so, closed down any truthful investigation by
Congress or by the state of Texas, or by the authorities in Dallas. J. Edgar Hoover was the FBI.
He ran the FBI, and whatever he said went. And he was in total charge of investigation. And the Warren Commission, whether they were good or cover-up artists, nevertheless, they were at the mercy of the information given to them by the FBI. And, are you ready for this? Both of these two guys were about to lose their jobs because of the Kennedys. Life magazine, some officials have now verified that the very week of the assassination, or the week after, they were already set to run a big expose article on the criminal activities of Lyndon Johnson. They had been fed this by Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General, and they were going to blow Johnson out of the water. All right, the TFX scandal in Fort Worth, the Bobby Baker scandal, the Billy Saul Estes scandal. He not only was probably going to lose his job, he was probably going to go to prison. J. Edgar Hoover was about to lose his job because the Kennedys had let it be known in Washington that they were going to force Hoover's retirement because he was approaching the mandatory federal age limit for retirement, and they were going to invoke that and get him out of there. Of course, he had held power since 1924 because he had the dirt on everybody. And yet, in early January 1964, just a month or so after the assassination, Johnson held a press conference in the Rose Garden, praised Hoover for his anti-communist activities, and exempted him from the federal age retirement level, and thereby installed him as FBI director for life. Life magazine scrubbed the article because the magazine issue that came out the week after, needless to say, was not revealing the criminalities of Johnson, but about the assassination of President Kennedy. And both of these men took steps that made them accessories after the fact. Now, can I prove that those men orchestrated or ordered the assassination? No, and I doubt we'll ever be able to prove that. But what I can prove and can be demonstrated to beyond a reasonable shadow of a doubt is that both Hoover and Johnson took actions that blocked a meaningful, truthful investigation into the Kennedy assassination. Again, under our legal system, that makes them accessories after the fact, and they are guilty in the assassination. And I'm not the only one believing that. This letter from 1994 was from Evelyn Lincoln. Anybody know who Evelyn Lincoln was? Kennedy's personal secretary. She was with him at his elbow almost day and night. And if anybody knew what was going on in the Kennedy White House, I'm sure it was Evelyn Lincoln. And in this letter she said, it is, as for the assassination is concerned, it is my belief that there were that there was a conspiracy because there were those who disliked him and felt the only way to get rid of him was to assassinate him. And these 5 conspirators, in my opinion, were Lyndon Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover, the Mafia, the CIA, the Cubans in Florida. Thank you very much. Now, with all of the retrospective shows on TV and all the oohing and ahhing about the Kennedys and all the program about the assassination, how many times have you seen an interview with Evelyn Lincoln? Not there, is she? Because she knew. She knew what was going on. And so when the President of the United States is the guy behind the assassination and the head of the FBI is his aide, and they have total support from the corporate controlled mass media, now do you understand why the Kennedy assassination is considered controversial? And it all boils down to what Warren Commission, John J. McCloy, if you've read my book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich, you'll know that John J. McCloy was a mover and a shaker, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the largest lender of money to the Nazi government, and then served as High Commissioner to Germany, brought all the paperclip scientists over here, and then served on the Warren Commission to determine what happened to John F. Kennedy. And in one of their meetings, he said, it was of paramount importance to show the world that America is not a banana republic where a government can be changed by conspiracy. Well, folks, I'm here tonight to tell you, and I'm sorry to tell you, we are just another banana republic. And in fact, from the time of the Kennedy assassination through the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, the shooting of George Wallace, the shooting of, it just goes on and on. The shooting of Reagan, come on. From 1963 all the way up to about 1984, all those elections, all those presidential elections were decided by gunfire. We're just another banana republic. But whatever you do, don't mention the coup of 1963. But if you want to get all the details, the sources, get my new book, Crossfire, The Plot to Kill Kennedy, and you'll find out all you need to know. Now, how are we doing on time? We got plenty of time, I hope. Oh, yeah. Okay. Now comes the juice. What's that got to do with UFOs? All right. Well, first off, if you understand clearly what happened to Kennedy and the government can lie, can cover up, then you can begin to understand about UFOs. So why would they want to get rid of Kennedy? Well, we know some of the more obvious reasons, that he was going to pull us out of Vietnam. He had already thwarted the military and the Pentagon by refusing to use nuclear weapons in Laos. All right, and that he had already, in early October, signed a National Security Action Memorandum that said he agreed that we could pull all our troops out of Vietnam by the end of 1965. And in this presidential order, he says, make no public announcement, but begin the withdrawal of 1,000 advisors. Okay, the Monday following the Friday assassination, Lyndon Johnson issued National Security Action 273, in which he said military and financial aid to South Vietnam will not be lowered past the level of the Diem government. Well, that was October the 1st. So that essentially blocked Kennedy's pullout order. Okay? And it set us on the road to Vietnam. In fact, the real Vietnam War started in August of 1964 with the phony Gulf of Tonkin battle. There was never any battle. And yet Johnson went to the Congress and said, our boys are floating in the water. Give me the power, and I'll stop all this communist, aggression. And so they passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which abrogated the Constitution of the United States, which says only Congress has the power to declare war. And they gave that war-making power to Johnson. And by September of 1964, ground troops, including the Marines, were being sent to Vietnam. And then the bombing campaign of the North started, and we went into the major Vietnam War, which cost 58,000 American lives, wrecked our economy, and caused still a sore differences and schisms between families and generations. Okay, so we know that. We know that he was trying to make rapprochement with Castro, which only recently, within the past month or so, they're finally getting around to saying, talking about maybe we could do that. He wouldn't do it. He also had been meeting with Khrushchev and talking with Khrushchev on the hotline, and they had about decided to try to put an end to the Cold War. But then Kennedy got assassinated, the Cold War continued, and Khrushchev, within 6 months, had been ousted, and they didn't kill him, but they put him out to pasture, and we continued with the Cold War. We also know that his brother Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, was prosecuting organized crime as never before or since. In fact, the very morning of the assassination, he had had a big meeting with his organized crime task force. They broke for lunch, and then he got a call from J. Edgar Hoover. He said, "Ever met Harvey Oswald? He's an ex-Marine. He defected to Russia. He's a pro-communist. He's a mean-spirited individual in the category of a nut." All that came out about 20 years ago from FBI files, and this was like 2 hours after the shooting. Now, there's a good piece of circumstantial evidence for you right there. 2 hours after the shooting, Oswald had just been arrested at the Texas Theater, hauled out, brought down to the Dallas Police Headquarters. He had 2 sets of identification on him. One says he's Lee Harvey Oswald. The other says he's Alex James Heidel. Well, the police are saying, "Well, which one are you?" And he said he was being uncooperative. He said, "You're the cops, figure it out." And yet, at the time, the local authorities weren't even sure who they had in custody. Hoover is on the phone to Bobby Kennedy, giving a complete rundown on Oswald, who he knew all about 3 years earlier. Doesn't that tell you what was going on? Okay, but now, so we know all that was going on, but only the tabloids have broached the idea that Kennedy may have been killed because of what he knew about UFOs. And, of course, when I first read this, and I don't see the date on that, but that was a long time ago, and I just kind of laughed, because those tabloids, they'll just tell you anything. But then I found out that there is something called the Interplanetary Unit, the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. And that sounds pretty far out, but that's a legitimate government agency or unit that was active at the time of Roswell. And they actually produced a document which is now available, and it tells the truth about Roswell. It says that there was one crash site and that there was a lot of debris there, but that the main capsule continued on and landed at Socorro. So there was actually 2 landing zones. They talked about the radar contacts. They give a lot of detailed information about Roswell that so far, to the most serious researchers, turned out to be true. And at the very end of their report, it said some of the recovery operation was shared with Representative John F. Kennedy, Massachusetts Democrat, elected to Congress in 46, son of Joseph P. Kennedy, who was a member of the Commission on Organization of the Executive Branch of the government. Kennedy had limited duty as a naval officer assigned to naval intelligence during the war. It is believed that information was obtained from a source in Congress who is close to the Secretary for the Air Force. So in other words, and this document, by the way, was written back in 1947. How many of y'all knew that John F. Kennedy was in naval intelligence? Very few, because that is not very well known. But he was. I got time to tell you about. I'll just take the time. It's a great story. Who put Kennedy in the office in the first place? J. Edgar Hoover. How did he do that? Okay, World War II, and John F. Kennedy, young naval ensign, is stationed in Washington with naval intelligence. But he liked the women. Big surprise there, right? So he's hanging around with Inga Arvan. He called her Inga Binga. Inga Arvan was a former Miss Sweden, quite a looker, and who had hobnobbed with some of the leading lights of Europe, including Adolf Hitler. So the FBI suspected her of being a Nazi spy. So they bugged her apartment. And who do they get in their tapes but John F. Kennedy? So they go to Joe, his father, and they say, listen, you got a problem here, because we think your son may be hobnobbing with this Nazi spy. So J. Edgar Hoover calls in Joe Kennedy and said, we got to do something about this. So he went to Jack Kennedy and they told him, you got to start seeing her and you're going to have to start acting back military guy. Well, Jack Kennedy was young and fervor, and he was just like all young guys at World War II. He said, well, if I can't play Playboy, I want to be fighting the enemy. So he demanded that they send him to a combat unit. So sure enough, they sent him to the South Pacific, put him in command of a PT boat, PT 109. And, of course, he lost his command. He'd gotten run over by a Japanese cruiser one night and split all apart, which on the one hand probably should have earned him a court-martial. But then on the other hand, though, he, with a bad back, he took his wounded engineer, put the Mae West strap in his mouth and swam all the way to this island with this guy, helped save him, helped save the rest of the crew. They were on this island, out of food, out of water, no ammo. And they found out that this island was held by the Japanese. Well, now they're really down. They're going, let's give up. Let's just give up. I'll just sit out the war in a POW camp. And John Kennedy said, nope, I'm going to get you out of here. And sure enough, he kept messing around until he found some natives that were somewhat friendly to him. And he managed to get word back to another island that was in the control of the Allies. They sent a submarine, and they got John F. Kennedy and his crew off the island and rescued him. So now the Navy says, okay, do we court-martial this guy, who's the son of a prominent senator and a very powerful politician, or do we make him a hero? Well, they made him a hero. And it was that fame in the PT-109 that launched him into politics, put him in the House of Representatives, then put him in as a senator, and then on to the president, all thanks to J. Edgar Hoover and his snooping. Isn't that a story? But then there was other things going on. Kennedy, by 47, knew the truth of Roswell, that there really was aliens, really was a crash. On June the 26th, 1961, he sends this memo to the National Security Memorandum to the Director of Central Intelligence, a review of MJ-12 intelligence operations. Well, MJ-12, that's not supposed to exist, but he was already onto it. And then we also know that Dorothy Kilgallen said that there was a secret visit by the president of the secret air base. So all of this was going along, and Kennedy knew about it. Now, in the fall of 1962, Glenn Pace and Rufus Bond were two photographers stationed at Area 51 in Nevada. Now, they did not have access to the lower levels, so they couldn't say with any certainty if there were aliens there or flying saucers, but they did have access to the joint cafeteria where the Project Paperclip scientists ate and other scientists that were working in these lower levels, and they heard all kinds of rumors, okay? But the story they tell is that in the fall of 1962, there was a buzz going on in the cafeteria among these scientists that the president, John F. Kennedy, was going to come and visit Area 51. And they were all kind of laughing and snickering about the whole thing because basically the attitude seemed to be, well, don't worry about it. We'll give him the dog and pony show like we give everybody else that shows up, and he'll thank us and go away. But then a few weeks later, when this visit took place, the whole attitude changed abruptly. These scientists were agitated, they were upset, they were mad. And it was plain, they said, because Kennedy had threatened to cut their budgets. Now, what happened there? I strongly suspect that Kennedy showed up at Area 51 and they said, okay, here's our spaceships and here's what we're working on and that's it. Nothing here to see, sir. But he was he didn't buy it because he knew from 47 that the Roswell crash was real. And so he tells them, look, quit lying to me or I'm going to cut your budgets. You guys are playing footsie out here. So they all got upset. So there is another nail in the coffin. Now, all the people at Area 51, he's threatening to blow the secrets. We also now have this November the 12th, 63 document where he is demanding that the Director of Central Intelligence Agency turn over to the White House all UFO files. And he said he wants it on his desk by no later than February the 1st, 1964. Now, any of y'all that have been in the military, been in the government, you'll probably understand what I'm saying when I tell you that if the CIA had handed over all of their UFO files to the Kennedy White House, they would have been leaked galore. And we would have known about, in 1964, the reality of UFOs and of the ET visitation. But on November the 22nd, Kennedy's cut down, and that was the end of that. So was he murdered too? I still personally do not feel that he was killed specifically to keep UFO secrets. But I do believe now that that was one of the straws that broke the camel's back. Keep in mind, let me see if is that it? Oh, well, to prove that this was going on, we have this document, National Security Action Memorandum 271, that I got out of the Kennedy Library, and he's talking, this is to the administrator of NASA, saying that he wants his cooperation because we were getting ready to go into joint space exploration with the Soviets, and he said we need to separate the knowns from the unknowns so that they won't think we're using this as a cover to spy on them. And sure enough, Khrushchev's son, I believe it is, his son, Khrushchev's son, later wrote and said, yes, they had agreed to go into joint space exploration. You know, now think about that. 1964? Come on, man. That would have ended the Cold War. And we would, military-industrial complex couldn't have that. So they shot Kennedy and they fired Khrushchev, and we continued with the Cold War. Lyndon Johnson, he knows what's going on. Listen to what he told the Senate Democratic Caucus January 7th, 1958. Control of space means control of the world. From space, the masters of infinity. Oh, remember that. Sure would like to know who the masters of infinity are. The masters of infinity would have the power to control the Earth's weather, to cause drought and flood, to change the tides and to raise the level of the sea, to divert the Gulf Stream and change the climate to frigid. This is the ultimate position, the position of total control over the Earth that lies somewhere in outer space. Now, what's going on right now? Climate change, droughts, tsunamis, earthquakes. Is it just natural phenomena or is it HAARP? Is it secret weapons being used? Is it stuff that they're developing all over the place? There's secrets, folks, and we're not in on them. And you tell your friends and neighbors, when you say you've been to a UFO conference and they start snickering, you tell them what I said. I don't care how brilliant you are, how smart you are, if you're operating with incomplete or erroneous information, you'll never be able to make any serious, correct decisions about anything. And if you laugh and blow off the subject of UFOs and aliens, then you'll never know what's really happening in the world because you're throwing out a big piece of the puzzle. Thank you all for listening to me. I think actually they had me down here to go to 9. It's only about 8:40, so if there's any questions, I'll be glad to answer anything I can. You can just shout them out so I can hear what you're saying. Any questions? No questions? Wow. Was I that good? Yeah, go ahead. What?
1963, Roswell was invaded. Incursion 6 to 10 times. The testimony was given to CNN before the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., 2010. I've got it right here, the affidavit that said November 63, 6 to 10 times they had incursions at Roswell. UFOs over missile sites.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to those were well documented. Wasn't just in '63. It goes back some, comes forward some. I've talked to some of those military officers, and there again, that's a good illustration of how you want to look at the UFO issue. It is absolutely true that over a long time period, that UFOs were seen over our missile installations, and the launching codes were changed. And they were flummoxed, okay, where they couldn't have launched them. Now, Colonel Corso, he told me, well, that proves they're enemies. And I said, why? He said, because they came over our air bases and we'd order them to stop and they wouldn't stop. And I said, well, that just means they're not obeying you. It doesn't mean they're enemies. He said, yeah, but they've changed the codes on our missile launches. And I said, yeah, but the missiles didn't launch. I said, have you ever considered the idea that maybe they were stopping us from killing ourselves? You know, maybe they didn't want those missiles launched and starting a third world war. You know, so it's really ambiguous as to what's going on. But I happen to believe that if the UFOs, which, by the way, if you all have done your homework, you'll know I'm telling you the truth. The UFOs predate 1947. They go all the way back. In fact, my newest book, Our Occulted History, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow, by the way, will show you the linkage between the ancient astronauts and today's New World Order. It's the same, folks, and they're still trying to run the planet. But anyway, that's what's going on. And it's nothing new. It's been all throughout history. So therefore, if the plan of the UFOs was to invade the Earth or to blow up our cities and like War of the Worlds, common sense would tell you it should have happened long before now. Why do you wait until we have nuclear weapons and laser technology, when they could have invaded us when all we had to defend ourselves with was spears? Come on, folks. They're obviously not overtly hostile, just as Nick Pope said. I like what Nick Pope said about tourism, No, seriously, I did graduate work for 2 years out at Lubbock, Texas, at Texas Tech, and I had a lot of good friends out there, and I had a good time out there. But I got to tell you, Lubbock, that's way out in the middle of nowhere. In fact, and at that time it was dry. You had to drive all the way out of town to Pinky's before you could get some beer or wine or anything. So there really wasn't much action going on in Lubbock back in the day. But I remember that on the weekends, especially if the weather was nice, there'd always be a collection of cars out at Prairie Dog Town. Because they'd all park out there with their sweethearts, and you sit on the fender or the hood of your car, and you watch little prairie dogs scurry around and run down the hole and get a little fight, and then run over and get something and run over there. And it's, aren't they so cute, And so I've long suspected that some of these folks that are coming and hanging around and being seen and not seen around the earth, they're just here to look at the prairie dogs. Look at that guy. So could be, but I don't think they're overtly hostile, or we would have heard something from that a long time ago. But here's what's scary. Y'all may remember that President Ronald Reagan got up before the United Nations and said, maybe what we need is a threat from space to bind the nations together, And I've often wondered, was he just speculating or did he know something? But I also know from my sources that the plans are in government filing cabinets to either take advantage of something or to even create something. We know today that they have technology hidden away from the public that's 10, 20, 30 years ahead of what's available to us. This is one of the things that leads to effective false flag events. Because if they use a technology that's not commonly known to the public, then they can put out any cockamamie cover story they want, and there's hardly anybody that can give them a serious rebuttal. So the idea is that if, in fact, Werner von Braun told Carol Rosen, who I've met and talked with, was head of Fairchild's Industry and worked very closely with Werner von Braun, our top lead Nazi rocket scientist. He said way back in the 70s, he said, today the common enemy is communism, world communism. He said, but when that doesn't work anymore, he said it'll be international terrorism, probably centered in the Middle East. Well, here we are. And he said, and it's beginning to fade a little bit, get threadbare. He said, when that doesn't work anymore, it's going to be a threat from space. So what's really kind of scary is that we have technology today where they might be able to put holograms in the sky. They might be able to create all kinds of things. They might be able to create some kind of a anti-gravity craft that would seem totally alien to our current technology, and they might make us believe that we are facing a threat from space just so they can say, get everybody fearful and giving up the last vestiges of our liberties. So I think you guys having an interest in UFOs, you are the vanguard of the watch that needs to be watching very carefully to make sure that the poor old unsuspecting public is not suckered into yet another false flag operation.
Any questions? Do what?
Go ahead.
Do you personally feel like you can, you're under investigation being written in any way by the government because you're revealing some of this stuff? I know it's been out there, but you're kind of putting it all together and giving it public, public forum.
In my whole career, as far as I know, I was only personally threatened one time, and that was not by the government. That was by a criminal that was a friend of Jack Ruby's, and he told me all this stuff, and then he said, don't write about that or I'll kill you. I said, well, wait a minute, you should have told me that before you told me all that, But no, I have been approached by several times by people in positions of authorities who very gently try to say, maybe you ought not write about all that stuff. But that's, to me, is not a threat. And frankly, ma'am, I don't feel like that I'm a direct threat to them. Number one, I'm too visible. My books have been out there for, 20, 30 years. If something untoward happened to me, it would only give me more credibility. And also, and here's the key point, like all the stuff I just told you about the Kennedy assassination, that's not conspiracy theory. That's all fact. But this is stuff that I've learned from other people, from researching, looking at documents. It's second and third hand information. I'm not a danger because I cannot go in, be called into a court and raise my right hand and swear I heard something, I saw something. I am not a first person witness. So I think they're see, look at this group here tonight. You guys are far thinking. I honor each and every one of you for coming out of your homes and to coming down here and to try to open your mind a little bit and expand your knowledge. But think about it. Look, we've got about 150 people here out of Del Rio and out of Eagle Pass and out of this whole population down here. We're just, they don't care. They'll let us talk all night if we want to. Just don't get 1 million or 2 folks upset,
So no, I don't think that it's a danger. You have a question over here, sir?
Yeah, tomorrow you're going to get into the SR-74, 75 platform.
The what?
SR-74, 75 platforms, space platform.
Oh, the space platforms. Oh, the naval? You're talking about the space fleet?
Yeah, the SR, the U.S. Air Force flying. This is the replacement for the SR-71.
Right. And I don't know if this is the same one you're talking about, but they do have they're working on a suborbital craft, and what I find really interesting is that we already know that they're calling it the Aurora. And I think y'all know why I think that's pretty neat, because one of the areas that I've really investigated is the spaceship crash in Aurora, Texas in 1897. Okay? Now, at that time, this was 6 years before the Wright brothers flew. There was nothing man-made in the air. And in fact, and I've had people go, oh, well, they had hot air balloons. Well, yeah, they did. But they were always tethered. They used hot air balloons in the war between the states when both sides would raise up these hot air balloons and guys with binoculars, and they'd sit there and spot troop movements and give intelligence to what the enemy was doing. But they were always tethered. They were always on a line. They'd roam up and they'd pull them back down. The first powered balloon flight took place the same year, 1904, that the Wright brothers flew, and this was several years before that. And so there was nothing man-made in the air. And I've always thought, because, since I started dealing with UFOs, which goes back into the 1950s, as a kid even, there's always been the argument, well, they're just secret government test craft. Somebody's testing some stuff there we haven't seen. And that's a legitimate argument. I listen quite seriously to that. Of course, I also listened at first to the very serious argument that it was just a mass hallucination, but then as I got to be a reporter, I thought, wait a minute, a heretofore unknown contagious mass psychosis. God, what a story. But you don't hear that anymore because it's not true. And the thing that put all that to rest about hallucinations or psychosis was the internet and cell phones and camcorders, because all of a sudden anybody and everybody was taking pictures of UFOs. Go up on the internet, go Google UFO and images, and it'll keep you occupied for months. They're just all up there, so you never hear the argument anymore that they're just hallucinations or some kind of undiagnosed contagious mass psychosis. All right, but you still hear the argument that they're government test craft. Well, okay, but what about 1897? There was nothing man-made in the air. And yet those stories were covered in the Fort Worth papers, in the Dallas Morning News, which is still in publication. And here's one. They'll get a little clue as to what's going on. When I was in the microfilm records of the old Fort Worth Record, the newspaper that predated the Star Telegram, a forerunner of the Star Telegram, I came across an article that was written at that same time period in the spring of 1897 about a railroad track inspector from Fort Worth who one day was inspecting railroad track up north of Fort Worth, and it started getting late in the day, and he was about ready to turn back and head back to the city when he noticed a very bright light up ahead. Now keep in mind, 1897, yes, in a few places, New York, Boston, maybe even Dallas, they had a few electric lights, but most people didn't have electricity in 1897. And to see a bright light when it was starting to get dark, obviously probably caught his attention and imagination. So he continues on up the track, and he said he found a large silver cigar-shaped object sitting on the tracks. And he said the crew that were dressed in uniforms were working around this craft. And he said he had a conversation with the commander. And he never made any statements. And, of course, the first thing the commander said was, don't tell anybody you've seen us. And, of course, true to human form, he ran right back to the city and told the newspaper what he had seen. But he said, but he didn't make any comment about the looks, and he seemed to have understood what the commander of the ship was talking about. So that's kind of interesting that they either are like us or can appear to be like us. But he said the commander told him, don't tell anybody about us because we're on a secret mission. He said, we're on our way to bomb Havana. Now, this to me is fascinating because this is the spring of 1897. It was not until the spring of 1898, a year later, that the battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor, and that launched us into the Spanish-American War, where Teddy Roosevelt fought the Battle of San Juan Hill on Cuba, and that Admiral Dewey, I think, says, damn the torpedoes, and they steamed in and took the Philippines and had a big war. But wait a minute, that supposedly just only happened with the explosion of the battleship Maine a year later. How did this guy know we're going to be fighting in Havana? Which tells me that they have some kind of time travel capability. And I'm pretty certain of that because one of the most interesting, I've interviewed dozen people who claim to have experiences in being taken up in ships, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, one dear lady was trying to tell me that, you know, she was in bed and she couldn't move. And I guess I was kind of looked off or something. And she said, young man, said, aren't you interested in what happened to me? And I said, well, yes, I am, ma'am. I said, but your story sounds exactly like the last 100 that I've heard, you know. Yeah, this is happening, okay? And I really care about your individual case, but you're not the only one. But one of the most fascinating ones was a fellow that I talked to up in the Northeast some years back. And he told me the story of, he said he had been taken ever since he was a young boy, and said initially it just scared him to death. But, you know, as is the human condition, anything doesn't kill you, you tend to get used to it. He said after a while he'd get these feelings and he'd go, oh, brother, here it comes again. And sure enough, they'd take him and off he'd go. So he said one night he was in his apartment, he was watching television, and he got thirsty, so he got up and he went around into his kitchenette area, opened the refrigerator, pulled out a can of, I don't know, beer or soft drink, but it was a can with a tab top, and, you know, that very distinctive pop, you know. He opens the can, goes back around, lays on the divan, sipping his drink, watching the TV, and he started getting that feeling like, uh-oh, it's going to happen again. Sure enough, next thing he knows, he's on the ship, and they're talking to him, and they're poking him and prodding him, and they're doing their thing. And said the next thing he knew, he was back in his apartment laying on the divan watching TV. And he said just as he was beginning to get his wits about him, he hears somebody in the kitchen open the refrigerator door. And he hears the of the soft drink can. And he looks up, and he said in just the time it took him to see and recognize what he was seeing, he saw himself coming around the corner into the living room, and then he just, in just an instant, just long enough for him to recognize what he was seeing, it faded away and went away, and he was back on the divan. Now, I don't know about you guys, but that tells me that they have, and we all know about lost time, they have the ability to take you, keep you for days on end, and then bring you back essentially at the same time they took you. Except in this instance, they were just off by a few seconds, you know. So that's really fascinating. And the other thing I want to leave you on kind of a positive note is that there are some people who claim that they're taking people and killing them, you know. And there is some interesting allegations coming out of foreign countries. But in all my years of studying the UFO situation, I don't really know of any well-documented case of a human who got taken and never came back. You know, they always bring you back, or at least the ones that come back say they brought me back.
So I don't know. I think we're getting ready. I totally agree with Nick Pope that I think that we are getting very, very close to disclosure. I think it could happen this year, next year, or certainly within the next few years. And you guys, you're in the enviable position because you're going to be able to tell all your neighbors.